Hello and welcome to Moments with the Master. This is the week before Election Day, which will be November the 3rd. I'm here with my brother, so I'm Father Josh, the Egg Friar, pastor at St. Martin's Celtic Catholic Church, and brother...
I am the felonious monk.
There we go. And so this week we're going to be talking about the readings from this past Sunday. We're going to kind of do a two-part thing. So Isaiah chapter 45, verses 1 through 6. Psalm 96, yes, verses 1 through 9. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And then Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 21. And as always, we encourage you to read them all yourself. We'll be looking at various things ourselves. I'm going to kind of hone in on the psalm and then the gospel. I'm not going to read the whole psalm. You should read it yourself, but the response is, tell it out among the nations, the Lord is King. I want you to keep that in your head through both of these videos. The Lord is King. But then from the gospel, Jesus, again, this is this is after the triumphal entry and Palm Sunday, and he's in Jerusalem and he's been questioned. And it says, the Pharisees went and took counsel how to entangle him in his talk. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully and care for no man, for you do not regard the position of men. That's a lie, by the way. They didn't believe that about him. But anyway, tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, it's interesting that they asked that question because they clearly all paid taxes to Caesar. And yet, what they're doing is trying to get him to say something extremely, controversial. But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the money for the tax. And they brought him a coin, and Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. So, here's the question. This passage, I think, has been used frequently by people to say, well, we should, do whatever the government says. And as long as it doesn't conflict with Scripture, we should do whatever the government says. Now, let me be really clear. There is no, and you can jump in anywhere you want. There is no, the Bible is clear that there is a role for government. And there are governments throughout Scripture. And if you go back and look at the Isaiah passage, God through Isaiah tells Cyrus, hey, I am going to use you to accomplish my purpose with Israel, because it was through Cyrus that, hey, there's my wife right there. It was through Cyrus that God had Jerusalem rebuilt. So if you go back to Nehemiah, Cyrus, in Nehemiah, Cyrus writes the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, which, by the way, starts the clock for the prophecy of the 70 weeks in Daniel, one of the chapters in Daniel. It's in Daniel. You can look. Daniel chapter 9. My youngest son and I were just looking at that the other day. But so it is clear that God. Now, Cyrus was not a good person. And I have heard people say, well, Donald Trump, the president, he does bad things, but it's okay because he's like Cyrus. This is where
You've heard that?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
See, I thought he was more like the Assyrians, like God chose the Assyrians to bring judgment on Israel, but it's not like they were good people.
Right,
Sorry,
whatever. So I want to read an article that was shared by a friend of mine. And I'll just read it real quickly, and then I want to comment on it in relation to the gospel. It's from the magazine called the National Review. This particular one is called Christian Nationalism Leads to Extinction. And it says, this weekend the president attended a charismatic church in Las Vegas during which the preacher prophesied that he would win a second term. Denise Goulet, the leader of the church, supposedly had a dream in which she was informed by God that Mr. Trump is getting a second wind that will carry him to re-election. American flags were also waved on stage during worship, and it wasn't at all clear whether the congregants were looking to Jesus or to Uncle Sam for salvation.
Real quick, National Republic,
National
Review is conservative, largely skewing, very Christian, very conservative, often Republican, occasionally Catholic. So this is not somebody who is trying to tear down Christianity. They're
That's
constantly
correct.
trying to build it up.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
And when I read that first paragraph, my first thought was, well, I wonder if he doesn't get reelected, if they're going to stone her to death for making a false prophecy. But anyway, well, we won't go there. Anyway, so it goes on. Oh, but it talks about the American flag waving and stuff like this on the stage, and, who are we trusting in? Whenever the Christian church identifies itself with any nation state or cause outside of itself, it invariably atrophies and dies. This is because the credibility of the faith is then made to stand or fall with the credibility of this other entity. If evangelical Protestantism becomes coextensive with the Republican Party, or even with American patriotism in the minds of potential converts, then it will soon find itself on the path to extinction. Both the GOP and the United States have been subject to serious political, moral, and military failures in the past. They will again in the future. If evangelicals are identified with either of these groups or with any temporal institution, then the failures of these groups will become their own failures also. Furthermore, if this historical pattern holds, the moral mistakes and shortcomings of American policy are likely to spell death for this particular brand of Christianity at some point in the future, if they haven't already. I do want to comment, it seems like that is already happening because churches are dying at an unbelievable rate in the United States. And there's a video that's attached, and it talks about this historian, Peter Hitchens, discusses how the Church of England's wholehearted nationalist embrace of the First World War completely eviscerated the credibility of Christianity in England and put the UK on the road to practical atheism that prevails there today. His historical diagnosis is worth a watch. In 1914, priests and prelates instructed the young men in their congregations to march forth in a war for Christian civilization. The nation learned afterward that it had sacrificed the flower of its manhood to resolve a falling out between cousins. As a result, the Church of England, having betrothed Christianity to such an unjust cause, died with all the boys she sent to the Somme. American evangelicalism will deserve the same fate if it devolves into the religious wing of a political movement. Now, I want to be clear that that article, although it's pointing at evangelical Christianity, this is true of Christianity in general. I personally believe, and I think Chris would agree, that maybe the worst thing that ever happened in the history of the church was official tolerance and then the making of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire.
It's why the Celtic Catholic Church has the fast of Constantine, because we're remembering when he saw the cross of the monogram of Christ and said, "In this sign conquer," and he used that at the fight of Milvian Bridge. Continue. Yeah,
so Christianity exploded in growth, like true growth in its early years, and under intense persecution. And I do not remember, I was trying to remember this today, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Oh, I just commented on that recently, because that's not... Okay, that captures the spirit of the thing, this Tertullian.
Okay.
And it's more like... a more exact translation is, the more that you kill us, the more that the seed will be planted and we will grow.
Okay.
I'm going to see if I can look that up real quick.
Okay, well, while he's doing that, that idea that it is suffering and the being on the outside that allows the church to truly grow is is amazing. And what we see is that when you tie throughout history, when you tie Christianity to a political movement, it kills Christianity. Now, you can say, oh, but there's lots of people going to church. Okay, that may be true, but how many of them are true followers of Christ? Well, let me ask you this. Let's just look at 2020. There were, back in the mid 20th century, around 70% of Americans said they were Christians. Most of those people are still alive today. Where are they? And why has the faith not been passed on? Why is it that today my youngest son's generation is like less than 10% Christian? It's because Christianity became about what makes me comfortable and creating a space in which I feel safe. And so, go ahead.
Exact translation, we multiply when you reap us. The blood of Christians is seed. Or this one, which I also like, we spring up in greater numbers the more we are mown down by you. The blood of the Christians is the seed of a new life.
So there you go. Christianity flourishes when it stands alone. And it struggles when it is tied. We look at this in American history. In the early days, when the Puritans and the Pilgrims came over to the Americas, to North America, and they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and it was extreme. They were suffering, and mostly because they wanted to be able to worship freely outside of the reach of the Church of England at that time, and within, I think, 2 generations, they had established this. You had to be a member of the church in order to be a leader in government, and they established this compromise where if I think it was your grandparents were members of a church, then you were okay. And Cotton Mather, who was one of the big wigs back then, one of his quotes,
hugely responsible for the Salem witch trials.
Oh, interesting. But also said, religion hath begotten prosperity, and the daughter has eaten the mother. It always happens, always. So Jesus says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. It's not that religion or faith should be tied to government. It is that religion or faith should be separated from government. So let me give you a good example. I was listening on the radio coming in today I cannot remember, dadgummit, the name of the Supreme Court case that basically legalized same-sex marriage. And there was a whole lot of back and forth and people saying various things, and the government should not be doing this. So this is kind of where I stand on that particular issue.
Actually, the Pope Francis just released, I don't know if he said this specifically or verbally, or if he released it in an encyclical, but he voiced his support for same-sex unions, not for same-sex unions within the church, but for civil unions, saying his quote was, they had suffered enough, and they should be allowed to live. Continue. That. And so here's the deal. The government does what they do, and we honor that because they are the federal government. And then within the church, we do what we do. Now, there are churches that fall in various ways on that. But for me, I think it was a mistake when the church in America, I don't know why I did that, but when the church in America... That's actually really because there's the church.
Yes, okay.
And we're considering the union of the idea of the church and America and this country.
Why was it a good idea? Why do I, as a pastor, have to be the person to fill out the federal government document that recognizes the marriage? I would far rather have a couple go to the justice of the peace or to the courthouse, get their marriage, if they want federal recognition and whatever tax benefits they get, to go do that. And then if they want to get married under God, come to me and we will do that as a separate thing. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Give to God what belongs to God.
Real quick, two quick things. First of all, there is, and these are rightly cited, but there's continual references, especially by Paul, to obeying those in temporal authority over you, obeying your kings, obeying, it's really throughout Scripture. But especially when we're talking about Paul, and I've said this before, but the fact that he is saying these things while he's under house arrest, while he's facing execution, talking about, the state bears the power of the sword for nothing, and that's our defense for the holiness or legitimacy of capital punishment.
And the state was about to unrighteously use that
Exactly.
power to kill someone who was innocent.
And then here in the gospel, Jesus is saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And, we know that Caesar was not using those taxes for good things,
No.
especially as at the time he had been declared a god, a demigod by the Senate. This idea that, even to some extent, the entire basis of this country was because we didn't want to pay taxes. And yet Jesus here is clearly saying, just
and if you disagree with that, read the Declaration of Independence. It is not about freedom of religion, although that is enshrined, and there are many that came to the Americas, the colonies, established colonies for religious freedom, but and it is enshrined in the First Amendment to the it's not even in the Constitution.
No, it's not.
It's an amendment to the Constitution.
But the Declaration of Independence was our justification for why we had to rebel. We really were a unique country in the entire history of the world, because we weren't just a group of people that were together and had decided to establish some form of government, or were conquering somebody else. We were the first ones to say, this is an idea, and we're going to base ourselves on the idea. It's really fascinating.
And an ideal.
Exactly.
Yeah, we didn't do great on that ideal. That's a whole other thing. I love history, and I don't want to get into all that. But to Chris's point, if you look at Scripture overall, from Genesis to Revelation, and think about how many of our big figures were either government, they were the government, like David, and by the way, we think about David and Solomon, and we have warm, fuzzy feelings about them and stuff like that. They were tyrants. Now, ideally, they were tyrants under God, but, you don't just...
tyrant used to be a good word.
Oh, I did not. Mm-hmm. I learned something new today.
As did dictator.
So, but you think about people like Daniel. Chris and I were talking about this earlier. Daniel, who under not Cyrus, but the Darius the Mede. Under Darius, the other guys don't like Daniel because he's so popular, and so they get Darius to pass a law that no one can pray to anybody but Darius for 30 days. And so Daniel goes and prays, and he gets thrown in the lion's den. He doesn't pray to defy the king. He prays because he always prays. He just did what he normally does.
He didn't protest for his rights to pray.
He did not go to the king because he had rights as a Medo-Persian leader. He had rights. I think he was number 3. He had rights, and yet did not go to the king and fight for his own rights. He separated and did what God told him to do, separate from the government, and then suffered the consequences as a result. And God used that to glorify himself. This video is getting really long. I'm going to wrap up my piece to say this. We need to be careful as the people of God about how we represent ourselves in relation to temporal governmental institutions. It's true anywhere around the world, but particularly true here. I do not want a Christian country. I want Christians in leadership that are truly followers of Jesus. But I don't think anybody here wants a theocracy or is asking for a theocracy unless God is truly in control. And the problem is that I think a lot of times we try to talk ourselves into the idea of God in power through people who are not representing God by any stretch of the imagination. I want to follow Jesus, and I want to obey the laws of the country to the extent that they do not come in conflict with what God says. I'm in the military. I wear the uniform of this country, and I'm about in 3 weeks. I have 4 weekends left at home, and I am about to go spend a year defending the ideals of our country in another country. I believe in them, but not. I do not believe that the ideals of this country are necessarily Christian, and that my faith and my government are one and the same. My faith.